QSO Today, episode 245, Joe Everhart N2CX. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for the radio amateur. They are excited to announce the new IC9700 VHF, UHF, and 1200 MHz all-mode transceiver. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, Ham Summers G0 UPL's kit company, and the creators of many fine radio kits including the popular QCX transceiver kit. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Links to both are in this week's show notes page. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for Z1UG, your host. Joe Everhart N2CX is well known in QRP circles for his technical contributions and articles in ham radio magazines. Along with George Heron, N2APB, my guest in episode 151 of the QSO Today podcast, they produce a live talk show called Chat with the Designers, as well as present at the QRP event 4 days in May that precedes the opening of the Dayton Hamvention in May. Joe is a builder and a ham radio designer, and he shares some of his insight into homebrewing while enjoying amateur radio in this QSO Today. N2CX, this is Eric for Z1UG. Are you there, Joe?
For Z1UG, this is Joe, N2CX.
Joe, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, as I was growing up, my father was a wireman at RCA, and he always had great dreams of getting his amateur radio license. Unfortunately, he passed away before that happened, but he lit the spark in me, and he always had some little electronic parts and stuff around. So, I was exposed to it, and I got my early education from him. Unfortunately, he passed away when I was about 12, and he had never gotten his license, but it stuck with me. And I grew up in the space age. My formative years were in the late 50s, early 60s, and tech and everything about it was interesting. So I became a science buff. I was interested in chemistry, and I was interested in electronics, and I decided that it was more socially acceptable to build radios than to build little exploding devices. So I got interested in radio as opposed to chemistry. Got my license as I entered high school. I was a freshman in high school in the early 60s, and I really enjoyed it. I had some good mentors along the way, and the local YMCA had some ham radio and Morse code classes. Now, I knew most of the theory. That was not a big deal, but the code was a hurdle. So they very patiently had a number of us teenagers, geeky teenagers, who they taught the Morse code and gave us a lot of practice. And as it turned out, even at that age, after about a year of that, I was up to 20 words a minute. And they found out that, much to my surprise, that they used me to help the others learn Morse code, because someone your age or someone of the same age and level of experience really catches on and teach more effectively than some older guy, some more experienced guy. So I did that. Went through high school. I was sporadically active. We had a number of other folks in high school at that time who'd gotten licenses. So afternoons when we got home from school, we'd all get on 40 meter CW and chat in Morse code.
Was this as a novice, or had you upgraded?
I had upgraded by this time. I upgraded, I think, within 6 months.
What was your first call sign?
My first call sign was WV2MES with the strange phonetics malicious egg smasher, which us teenagers enjoyed, but the older folks cringed.
And then you upgraded from novice then, and you became WA2 or WB2?
WA2MES, yes. Yeah. And then in probably 2 years after that, well, by the time I guess I was a high school senior, I upgraded to extra. And that was a matter not so much of not understanding anything, but at that time, you had to travel to the FCC office, the local FCC office, to get your license. Till I got a car, I was not able to do that.
What was the hometown?
New Jersey. I live in southern New Jersey.
Princeton.
A little south of Princeton, yes, but that area, right? Our FCC office was over in Philadelphia. about 10 miles away.
Is that Bucks County or something like that?
Well, that's Philadelphia County.
That's okay.
The city and county are the same there,
How about that?
but it's adjacent.
Do you remember your mentors?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I drove around my town after I'd gotten my license. I drove around my town on my bicycle, rode around, and I saw all the antennas and I knocked on doors. The first door I knocked on was a guy named Dave Cunningham, K2UDA, who was coincidentally his daughter was in my high school class. So, I didn't know him, but I knew his daughter. And we developed a friendship. And he really helped me along the way. He helped me get on the air, made my first contact on CW with his station, DX100, and an SB100, I believe it was, both East kits. And he got me comfortable with operating on the air. And then as I learned the code better at the YMCA, I got faster and faster. And he was just a resource for me to rely on. Helped me learn about how to put up an antenna, how to hold a successful contact on the air. The first contact, you're very nervous. How to do logging properly. And he had me join the local ham club there, the South Jersey Radio Association. And before I got my driver's license, he used to drive me there. So he was my early mentor. I didn't have a rig at the time. I wanted to get something, and he recommended I talk to a guy named Steve Branca, K2SB, and it turned out that Steve was a home brewer, and Steve had built up a 75-watt rig out of QST. So he sold me that rig, used an 807 and a 6AG7 and 807, crystal controlled. I had to build a power supply for it, but it was not a big deal. And that got me on the air. I had found an ARC-5 receiver, a military surplus receiver at some of the surplus stores in Philadelphia. So I got that on the air with my Steve Branca rig. Then, since Steve had got me the bug of building, I proceeded to build a number of other little simpler transmitters, all generally based on tubes, because that was the thing at the time, and all crystal controlled. And just really got the bug for building.
How did Dave Cunningham react to your cold calling him?
He was very receptive. As many guys were at least at that time, they were always willing to meet new or prospective hams and help along the way. They're very good about that. I was rarely turned away by anyone or turned off.
Do you remember your first contact on the air?
I don't remember the call sign, but I remember it was a fellow in Ohio. It was an 8 call. And as I say, I was very nervous, but Dave walked me through it. He made me use the key. He wouldn't hop in and do anything. He made me do it. He wrote me out a little script as we went along, and I just copied that and went through it. It was a great feeling of relief once I'd done one. Because of that, I had the nerve to go try 3 or 4 more that same day, which was really great.
Do you still knock on doors when you're in ham radio neighborhoods?
I have been known to do it. Yeah. It doesn't always work out. More often I see someone with a mobile antenna or their call sign or a double arrow sticker on the back of their car. I'll go up and introduce myself. That generally works out pretty well.
What's the current rig?
My current rig is a KX3, the Elecraft radio. I've lately gotten into portable operating. Though I have a number of homebrew rigs, the KX3 has everything in one package. That's very convenient to take portable. So
yeah, it's pretty cool.
I've made I know almost exactly 13,000 some contacts in the last 3 years.
Really?
With that KX.
With the KX3?
Yes.
Well, that's pretty amazing. And how are you doing that? Are you taking it out when you're taking it out the field under some kind of a contest or organized activity?
Well, what got me, I've always been interested in portable operating, but it's been kind of low key. When the family would go out camping, I'd put up a dipole and get on the air. I'd get involved with the local field day. But in 2016, when the national parks on the air came along, that really clicked. I've always enjoyed operating in parks, in temporary things, the national parks on the air was the match that got the fire started, and I ended up activating something like a quarter of the national parks or national park units in the country in 2016.
Really?
And it's just taken off from there. Yeah.
Well, that's pretty amazing. And there are a lot of things that are national parks, like the White House is a national park, for example, right?
Yes.
So
I'm fortunate because I'm near Philadelphia, so there are a lot of national park units there. Yeah.
Oh, that's quite amazing. 13,000 contacts. Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made then for your education and career?
Yes, most certainly. I was fortunate enough to, excuse me, when I was graduating from high school, I didn't have enough money to go to college. I had good enough grades, and I'd had offers from colleges to let me attend, but I couldn't afford it. So local company, Philco Radio, had a thing called the Philco Tech School. And they were trying to expand their tech school to beyond people within their own company. So they gave out a couple scholarships. A buddy of mine, trying to remember, Sidney Schusterman, at that time K3SME, and I both won scholarships to Philco Tech. So we attended that, Philadelphia. It was an 18-month school, taught us an awful lot of basic math up through calculus, physics, a lot of good electronic theory. They taught us tech writing, and even taught us how to write a good resume. So very, very good experience. After that, I got a job. Actually, during that time, I got a job as a tester at General Electric in Philadelphia. I worked there part-time. They hired me because I had some technical background. And then when I got done with that, I still didn't have enough money for college. So I went to work for RCA as a technician. Because of my ham license, I kind of got my foot in the door anyway. And because of the education at Philco, I had an extremely good background in modern electronics. So I worked in several areas of electronics there, primarily in component testing. They were doing component testing, semiconductors and other electronic components for other manufacturers, qualifying some of their devices. And in fact, though RCA was a competitor, in that lab, we actually built some of the test devices that the other manufacturers, such as TI, used in their product lines for testing their components. And I got a very good practical background there and a lot of hands-on. And then I guess I worked there about 2 years.
That RCA's corporate headquarters was there right outside of Princeton?
It was in I
remember driving to Princeton and actually seeing it. That was the home office, right?
Sarnoff Labs, yes.
Wow.
And I worked down in Camden.
Oh, so they had business units all over the place.
Oh, they did. They were enormous, yeah.
So what happened after that?
Well, I got married in August, and in September I started at Drexel University in Philly, studying electronics. Took me 5 years. I got my EE degree, which was good. It was a co-op school, which meant that you went to school part of the year and worked part of the year in industry. So it helped pay for the education. It was good because in addition to that, I took another part-time job in electronics for a little company called ESCO, which was run by a friend of mine, Jay Shaw, K2BZK, and a buddy of his, Jerry Tessler, W2GIA. They made teletype demodulators, modulators, and several other little kits for amateurs. So I worked there, made a few bucks, went to Drexel. I even designed actually some of their kits as a 19-year-old. I got a very good practical education there. And then eventually graduated Drexel and went off to industry.
In one of your bios online, it says that you say you're a product of the space age. What does it mean now to be a product of the space age?
Oh, absolutely. Pardon me. In the late 50s, early 60s, with a space race going on, there was a lot of interest in science and technology. They call STEM these days: science, technology, engineering, and math. So a lot of kids got interested in that sort of thing. And I fell in that group. Unfortunately, when Sputnik went up, I did not yet have a receiver. So I went over to another buddy's house who did have a receiver, and we were actually able to listen to Sputnik beeping from space, which was really cool, really, really cool. And, just a general atmosphere of availability of technical education. We had electronic surplus stores over in Philadelphia, so we can buy parts cheap, and just a lot of people interested in electronics and in ham radio. So it just kind of mushroomed out of that.
And now this message from ICOM America. I'm so excited to be able to tell you about the new ICOM IC9700 SDR transceiver. ICOM had in mind the weak signal operator when it applied its DSP and direct sampling technology to the IC9700's receiver design, allowing the operator to dig out the faintest signals from moon bounce and meteor scatter contacts. The ICOM IC9700 is a tri-band VHF, UHF, and 1200 MHz transceiver. Operating modes include AM single sideband, FM, CW, RTTY, and all of the digital modes. You can even use the IC9700 to talk on the local D-Star repeater, making it an ideal rig for exploring the amateur bands 2 meters and above. For the satellite operator, the IC9700 has dual independent receivers that allow full duplex crossband operation with normal and reverse tracking, and 99 memory slots for your favorite satellites. The IC9700 is beautifully appointed with an almost identical footprint to the IC7300. It will make a beautiful sidekick to your current HF rig in your shack. With its 4.3-inch color touchscreen, you can easily control the rig and find the band activity using the waterfall display. To learn more about the IC9700 or any of the other fine ICOM products, go to www.icomamerica.com/amateur or click on the ICOM banner in this week's show notes page. And when you visit your local ICOM dealer to purchase your IC9700, be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO Today. As a product of the space age, did you actually end up working in the space industry?
I did. I went through several companies, but eventually I ended up back at RCA there in Camden as an engineer. First projects I worked on there were military satellite terminals that were used. They were actually shelters that could be hauled into any remote area and have access to the military communication satellites. I worked on them for several years. Went into other things, other projects associated with that sort of thing in the communications area, and eventually I was fortunate enough to be assigned to work on first some ground test equipment for the International Space Station. And then eventually I became a systems engineer, and another ham, actually, Pete N2LVI, and I worked on the specs for I believe it was a C-band radio that was going to be used on the space station. And we wrote the specs. RCA did not build it, but we spec'd it out to a company up in Canada, visited them to be sure that it was going along well. And when we got the first prototype, this was really fun. When we got the first prototype back in Camden, it was a self-contained unit with the entire transceiver there. It had actually a data mux input, which was multiplexed voice and data, and a separate, I think it was a 4-foot dish antenna. Well, we checked this thing out as best we could, in the lab and such. Pardon me, we couldn't test it on the air. So RCA came up with a bright idea of working with NASA to actually test the thing on the air. So another fellow who's not a ham and I set it up in the parking lot. We set up the data communications equipment to it in a trailer and sat it on the back of a trailer, worked with NASA and a software development firm to get the operating software written. And we were able to transmit up to the tracking and data relay satellite, TDRS. NASA down in Greenbelt was able to communicate through it with us, just kind of on a very informal basis. And then from that, RCA and NASA got the great idea that they'd have a demo of the darn thing. So NASA brought their trailer with a kind of a sister communications system in it. We set it up and we communicated through this little 10-watt C-band radio up through TDRS to their terminal on the other side of the parking lot. And we set up a sound system. We got in a bunch of executives from RCA, from General Dynamics, from Boeing, many of the other manufacturers, and some NASA big shots, in addition to several astronauts. And we set up a mock communication between a NASA tracking system, a control center, and the astronauts as if they were on the space station. Really kind of cool.
And of course, there's a little delay across the parking lot, right?
Yeah. Well, but we were transmitting through TDRS, the satellite, which was in synchronous orbit out over the equator. So it was, it was real in that sense.
Joe, how was the system finally deployed?
The system was finally deployed as just a part of NASA's normal upgrades to the space station. It was not the primary communication system. It was a backup system, but they periodically use it to, they test it to be sure that they have a secondary communication system in case the main system goes out.
Now, when we're talking about the space station, are we talking about the original Skylab, or are we talking about ISS?
This is ISS.
Ah, okay. And by that time, had Skylab flown yet, or? Yeah,
Skylab had flown, and in fact, I think it had re-entered the atmosphere by then.
And burned up, yeah. It's amazing how time flies.
Indeed.
So how long did you stay with RCA, and how did your career progress from there?
I was with, as I like to put it, I went through 5 companies in one desk. I stayed with RCA, who then sold to GE, who then sold to Martin Marietta. They became Lockheed Martin, and Lockheed Martin spun us off as L3 Communications. So anyway, a number of things along the way, but a couple things really worked out because I was a ham. In the mid-'80s, we deployed a system called GWEN, the Ground Wave Emergency Network, which was in the LF region, 150, 175 kilohertz. It was to provide communications in the event of catastrophic conditions where all the satellites were gone, the ionosphere was gone, so there was no radio communication that way. This was based on ground waves, and they had 50 sites across the country. RCA got the design job for that. I worked on the early specs because I was a systems engineer, and then got to be the engineering test director for the program, where we ran testing for the military to demonstrate that the stuff actually worked. And then once we deployed it, it went out to the field, and I became the engineering field manager of the engineers and techs who went out with the construction folks and actually deployed the stuff, hooked it up, made it all work, communicated with it. Because of my background, my very practical background, when the guys had a problem in the field, I was kind of the last resort. So I'd get a call at 4 a.m. I'd have to go out to California, to Sacramento, because they had a site that went down and wouldn't work. So I had to quickly troubleshoot, find out what was going on, and make it work. And also, as part of being part of the field management, I was involved in selling off the sites. When we installed them, the Air Force, before they would sign the dotted line and give us final payment, it had to be demonstrated to them at every site that the system worked, that they could communicate with it, and that it could be controlled back from their central headquarters. So I became the guy who went out and held the customer's hand as we sold off all the sites in the field and made them work, which of course meant that several times along the way things didn't work. So, under the gun, we had to make it work.
Now, were these voice and data networks?
It was all data. It was all data. All data, yeah. It was, you could say it was the button. It was the, trying to remember the acronym, but it was the basically the launch control commands that would go out to
for the second strike.
Yes, exactly.
Right, because I guess if you're using Gwen, you've already had a first strike.
Yep, that's right. Exactly right.
Okay, well that's interesting.
This was superseded eventually when the Milstar satellite system came along, but for a couple of years that was the main backup emergency system for the button.
Well, that's quite interesting. Now, were you active as a ham radio operator all this time?
Sporadically. I always enjoy homebrewing, and I always built things, but I didn't always have the time to operate. However, since I got to I went to all but 3 or 4 states in the course of working, and I'd quite often take along a little rig. I had, I'm trying to remember what it was. I had a small rig, a couple watt rig. Oh, it was a Sierra. It was a Elecraft Sierra.
NorCal Sierra.
Yeah. Well, it was NorCal, and then eventually, that's right, it was NorCal, right?
Right.
Anyway, I'd take along a wire and go string it up in a tree somewhere in a motel parking lot in the middle of nowhere, and just get on the air in the evening. It was kind of fun.
Well, I think that was you're doing exactly what the spirit of the NorCal Sierra was for operators who would be working from hotel parking lots, in the dark.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that means that you're a QRP operator. How do you define QRP?
Well, the official definition is on CW if you run 5 watts or less, I think on data also 5 watts or less, or on phone if it's 10 watts or less. I'm a little looser than that. If conditions are rough, I'll crank my KX3 way up to 10 watts. But it's generally somebody who likes to work with low power. Now, I joined ARCI, the Amateur Radio Club International, in, I think it was 64, when it was 100 watts. And at that time, I had a Globe Scout, which was 65 watts. And then over the years, they reduced it to 5 watts. And I went along accordingly. I had a succession of QRP rigs over the years.
Do you think the reduction of the power for QRP was really based on the transition from tubes to transistors?
A lot of it was, yeah, because in the early days, it was much easier to get power from low power from transmitters and tubes until well into the 70s. There were no decent RF power transistors. That had a lot to do with it. And homebrewing. It was much easier to build a little homebrew QRP rig than a tube rig, though I've done both.
When I Google N2CX, I get a lot of replies that come back about that you're the ultimate antenna builder. What's the ultimate antenna for a QRP operator?
It's whatever works. I don't know that I'm the ultimate antenna builder, but I've always had fun with antennas. I've had several. If I'm going to operate at a fixed location where I can put up decent supports where I have trees, my favorite antenna really is, frankly, a horizontal dipole. They're efficient. Importantly, they're repeatable. They have repeatable performance. You know what you're going to get. And they're fairly easy to build. Downside is they're tougher to multiband than some antennas. And particularly for my park operations, a lot of times I can't put up antenna supports. I won't be able to put anything in trees. A secondary antenna that is almost as good and is a little easier to put up is an end-fed half-wave antenna, where, for example, for 40 meters, it's basically 66.5 feet long. You feed it at the end with a matching transformer that'll take you down to 50 ohms, and it will also work on even harmonics. So it'll work just as well on 20 meters, 15 meters, and 10 meters. And if you have a broadband matching device, you can do that. Single wire, you can put it up as an inverted L, you can put it up as a sloper. I have one in my backyard that's an inverted U between a couple telescoping poles, and it does me good stead. For most of my park operations these days, I have what amounts to a base-loaded vertical antenna. I'm in my 70s now, so I don't go traipsing out in the woods much, and I like to be simple about things. So I have a modified mobile mount on my car with an adapter. I have a 17-foot telescoping fishing pole on it with a wire running up it. It's 16 and a half feet long, so it's resonant on 20 meters. And I have a loading coil board on there with loading coils for 30 and 40 meters. It's not as efficient as a bigger antenna, but I can set it up in 5 minutes. And using the car as my antenna mount, I can operate from darn near anywhere. In good weather, I run a feed line away from the car, and I'll go sit at a park bench or a park table and operate. In bad weather like it is now, it's cold and windy and rainy and snowy out. I sit in the car and operate. And it's unobtrusive enough that I have never been kicked out of a park for having that ugly thing on the back of my car. Whereas when I tried to put wires up in trees or put up poles, the rangers discouraged it and told me that if I did that, they'd kick me out of the park. So that's what I call my go-to antenna.
Now, do you use the car as the counterpoise?
Yes, good point. Many people, when they put an antenna on a car, they just use a magnet mount. When they do that, they don't have a decent ground connection. I have an SUV, so I have the mobile mount on my hatchback there, and I run a ground wire from there to the mounting hardware for the hinge, which gives me an effective ground. It's not as good as having 100 radials out under it, but it is very effective. I routinely, on 20 meters, work when I go out on my park ops, half a dozen or more European guys on 20, work out to the West Coast, all over the U.S. and Canada. On 30, I can do almost as well. And on 40, I generally, even at QRP, can work the eastern half of the U.S. and Canada with no problems at all. So it's a very effective, simple, cheap antenna, and it works.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. I think a lot of new hams, and frankly even some old hams, think that if you have a ham radio station and you have an antenna, that antenna has to be multi-band. As a QRP operator, and with say limited space and resources, what is multi-band? I mean, how many bands is enough?
It's never enough. It's like the old saying: if your antenna fell down in the winter, it wasn't big enough. You can't have enough bands. But practically speaking, if you work on HF, particularly with the sunspots the way they are these days, I think the money bands are 40 meters, 20 meters, and 30 meters for CW, with 40 being the probably the most effective band. It's open basically 24 hours a day, and you get a reasonable number of contacts. During the day, 20 meters is great. As I say, I routinely work all over the country, but and 30 is kind of intermediate. But those three bands are probably the best.
Those are the money bands.
Yeah.
So you kind of answer my question, because one of the questions I had here for you is that it seems that most of the single band QRP kit transceivers these days, from places like the 4-State QRP Club, BitX, which is from India, QRP Labs, they all start with a 40-meter rig before they go to other bands. Is it because 40 meters is the money band?
Yeah, that and the fact that 40 meters, it's easy, probably easiest to build a rig for 40. It's not as fussy component-wise as the higher bands. What's
the NJ QRP homebrewer? I saw one on for sale for $8.
Yeah, and George Heron, N2APB, and I. George used to live in New Jersey. We got together and formed a loose group we called the New Jersey QRP Club, and we both like to write. So he put out the NJQRP. It wasn't a newsletter; it was a little magazine where we solicited articles basically about homebrewing and QRP topics. Published that to to disseminate lots and lots of info and to get some revenue for the club to help support club activities and to be able to produce kits to distribute to the ham community at large. So that was a means of getting info out to people and for helping to support the club. Did another one called QRP Homebrewer along the way. Basically the same idea. They got a lot of cheap labor out of us for that, and it was a lot of fun. They got us involved in things.
Are you guys also the QRP guys then? Is that?
No.
Okay.
No. QRP guys, Doug Hendricks, KI6DS, buddy of mine out in California, was in NorCal, had why the devil did that come up? And that just came up on my computer without me doing anything. Anyway, Doug Hendricks had a kit building company or a kit distribution company. He solicited designs from people and through NorCal sold an enormous number of kits.
Like the Sierra, for example.
Yes. They were designed by other people. He would buy the parts. NorCal would buy the parts, and he'd encourage volunteers to help bag the kits and sell them and distribute them. Well, as time went on, I think Doug kind of got burned out on doing that. It got to him, and he was nearing the end of his teaching career. He was a teacher out there, so he kind of let the kit. He sold his kit business actually to James, one of my buddies, KA5DVS. His name escapes me at the moment. Who had a company called Pacific Antennas. So it's now Pacific Antennas and QRP Kits. At any rate, so Doug got out of that for several years. Well, then he retired from teaching, and I think he wanted something to do. So he started up a thing called QRP Guys, which sells a number of kits, some very good kits at very low prices. And that's how that got started. Again, they're designed by a number of people. Doug and his guys just put the kits together and make available some very handy kits to the QRP and homebrewing community.
Now, you said that you and George also created some kits. What kits did you create?
Actually, the first one I created for the club was a thing called the Rainbow Tuner. NorCal had a design competition for little kits that could be built in an Altoids tin. So being an end-fed antenna buff, half-wave end-fed antenna buff, I designed a little resonant tuner for end-fed half-wave antennas, and I designed a little SWR bridge that had multicolored LEDs that lit up in succession from high SWR down to, I think it was high SWR 3-to-1, 2-to-1, and then 1.5-to-1 and below, with different LEDs, multicolored LEDs, as a rainbow. So that became one of the very popular NJQRP kits. We had a thing called the SOP receiver, seat of the pants receiver, which was a homebrew receiver, basically, I believe, for 40 and 80 meters. I'm trying to think of all the kits. We had just a whole slew of kits that came out over the years. Some original designs, some designs from other folks that we used to help support the club. And as an adjunct to that, George and I, for several years, ran a thing called Atlanticon, which was a convention here on the East Coast, basically in the Pennsylvania and Maryland area, where we did a day's symposium, and we always had a kit that went along with it. When you bought your advance registration or paid at the door, you got a kit along with it. So we had a number of small kits there. There was one that was a sniffer, which was a tunable multi-band field strength meter. One year it was the Badger, which was a name tag badge. If you ordered ahead of time, it had your call sign printed on it and a picture of a badger on there. Well, it also, if you pushed a button on there, sent your call sign in Morse code. Oh, we called it the Badger. And there were just a number of other kits that came along the way for similar things.
Now, was this a business? Did this end up being a business?
We actually, it was a nonprofit business. We didn't make salaries or anything. We plowed the money that came from that into running Atlanticon and to building or selling kits. It was kind of a self-perpetuating thing.
Funded your hobby with products from your hobby.
Absolutely.
It's the best way to do it, I think.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It kept us busy, I'll tell you that.
What do you think was the most complex and challenging homebrew project?
We had several. George and I collaborated on something that it was a homebrew project that eventually became a product. George now has a company called Midnight Design Solutions that sells various kits. We collaborated on a thing called the Micro 908 Antenna Analyzer, which had a rather simple SWR bridge in it, but it also had a digital synthesizer in there to generate a signal and a microprocessor to control it and a display so that you could tune the thing to whatever frequency you wanted in HF and measure not only the SWR, but the microprocessor in there calculated the impedance and the RNX values for corresponding to that SWR. And as I say, that eventually became a product of him. But that was probably the most complex thing that he and I collaborated on.
A real brain bender.
It was. It was hardware and software and RF design and all that all tied into one. And microprocessor and digital chips too.
So what's on your bench today?
What's on my bench today? I have several things. I have built several matching transformers for end-fed half-wave antennas. I have some commercial ones. I built some homebrew ones. And what I'm doing now, I'm trying to come up with a decent one. I've built some QRP ones that work fine. But I have a blind friend, Tony, W-A-3-C-A-O, and I'm trying to build a 100-watt end-fed matching transformer for him so that he can have an end-fed half-wave at his house and get on the air. I mean, it's not a big project, but it's it's something, and it's got to be foolproof for him because he can't fiddle with the darn thing and make it work. So I'll do that for him.
Well, that's pretty cool, and I think this is kind of an ideal antenna, perhaps, for people that live in homeowners association properties, because it seems to me to be very stealthy.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, in fact, at my house, it's not stealthy, but my backyard is filled with utility wires for me and my three neighbors. So I have two telescoping poles, 25-foot poles along the fence line, and I just run a 67.5-foot wire as an inverted U to get something in the air anyway.
And you're still talking around the world.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
With an end-fed antenna, and the counterpoise is on the ground, or?
Well, you don't. With an end-fed half-wave, you really don't need a counterpoise. If you're running QRP, the feed line can be kind of a counterpoise.
I see.
If you're running QRO, you can get into some RF feedback problems, but just a couple feet of wire off there is enough to take care of keeping RF off the shield of the coax.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Han's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. You and George Heron into APB, George was my guest in episode 151 of the QSO Today podcast, have a live talk show called Chat with the Designers. Do you still produce that show? And how did it start?
We do periodically. Unfortunately, he has semi-retired and moved to Tennessee from Maryland. And in his wind down from his day job, he's still rather busy. So we only do that sporadically. Started out because, as we had done with the NJQRP magazine, we thought we had some info to put before the ham community and to share it with them. So George actually came up with the idea as things came along. There's a program, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. Anyway, there's several programs where you can get on online and have a chat situation. So he devised a thing called Chat with the Designers, where we would pick a topic and come up with a show. Okay, the program is called TeamSpeak. We'd come up with a show. It started out once a week, then she became twice a month, and then once a month, and now it's sporadic. But we would have an online thing where he and I would talk together, but others could listen in and could also chime in and take part in the discussion, ask questions of what we're presenting, and just have a general roundtable sort of thing. Along with the Chat with the Designers, there's a web page, and we have what we call a whiteboard for each session, which has a number of figures on there and the talking points that we're going to discuss, so that people can follow along looking at that on their web browser to see what we're talking about, to see the diagrams and schematics and such, and then follow along with the voice and chime in as they want to interactively along the way. Unfortunately, with us going more sporadically, the number of participants has dropped off a bit. We've been, we've had highs of 20 and 30 people on there, but as our schedule becomes more erratic, it's dropped off so that now if we have 10 people, we're lucky. So we're kind of getting a little turned off of the idea because it's a lot of effort to put out to get ready for one of these things. And we don't really see that everybody gets a benefit from it. So we'll do them sporadically, but not on a regular basis.
Were they recorded and put up on YouTube?
They're not put on YouTube, but you can go to the Chat with the Designers webpage, and there are audio recordings of them. And the whiteboards are there also.
Oh, I see. So there are audio recordings of them, and the whiteboards are synced with the audio, or they're just static slides?
Yeah, they're just separate slides, yeah.
Okay.
There are other podcasts. We try to inject a little life in not just having a podcast, but having a conversation between ourselves, and then trying to involve other people to make it a little more lively than somebody just talking to a screen, not with an audience to get feedback and such. We try to make it a little more live that way.
Right, and inject some humor.
Yeah,
and keep it flowing, right?
Podcasts. I'm not knocking you for your podcast, but we tried to add some life to it.
No. I'm not taking it that way at all. This is a different format.
Yeah. Now, another thing, George and I have done presentations at Atlanticon and at 4 Days in May and other ham conventions. We really like the format of having two of us do the presentations, where one guy will play the straight man, and he'll talk and discuss, and then the other guy will kind of break in and say, "Well, what did you mean by this?" Or, there's another idea. So we kind of have a conversation on the stage to keep things lively. He and I interact that way pretty well.
And are you scheduled to do any of these presentations soon?
The Chat with the Designers, no. We don't have any on the schedule currently. However, at 4 Days in May, George is going to do a presentation on building a home workshop. He has just gone through that with his new move, reset up his workshop. I'm going to do a presentation on portable antennas for the QRP, a near and dear topic to me. And then we're going to do a joint presentation on another topic, piece of test equipment. So we'll stay live that way.
Joe, if one of the hams listening wanted to start to be a home brewer because he's not already a home brewer, what advice would you give to him to get started?
Go out on the web and see what's available. And what really worked for me was to try to find somebody local who has a little more experience and some interest in that to act as an elder to get you going. Because you don't know what you don't know. Steve Branca, I mentioned, K2SB, he had a neat workshop, And, I kind of looked over the shoulder as he was building things. He taught me all sorts of little tips about what kind of tools to use, what kind of wire to use, what kind of construction techniques, and other things. Another thing he taught me that really has worked over the years, if you're building something from scratch and you got to go out and buy parts, don't just buy exactly what you need. Buy a couple extra, because by golly, there's going to come a time somewhere along the way that you're going to need some of those things. So that way you can build a stockpile of parts. So having an Elmer is probably one of the best ways to go, if you can find one.
Do you think that kit building is homebrewing?
To some extent. I build some kits. I build them because there's something that's already designed to do something that I don't have the stamina to design. It's a start, I'll put it that way. As a teenager, I built a lot of heath kits, and that helped spark the interest in building my own stuff. Like I say, it's a start.
If you're new to home brewing and maybe you don't have a lot of experience with electronic tools and test equipment, maybe kit building is a way to start where you actually may end up with something that's working.
Absolutely. Yeah, get your hands dirty, do something. Yeah. Great idea.
There's an article, actually it's a bunch of slides about the Midnight Loop antenna that you built, which is a magnetic loop antenna. What is the Midnight Loop antenna?
Well, a lot of people build loop antennas out of various things, wire, coax, tubing. To make an efficient loop antenna, you need a very low resistance loop conductor. Ideally, the best thing is something like 2-inch copper tubing, but that's heavy and clumsy.
And expensive.
Yes. We just took a different tack, trying to see what we could do with something you could buy at Home Depot. And we made a 3-foot loop out of aluminum flashing. I think it was 6-inch wide aluminum flashing. And one of the other things two things that add to loss are not having a low loss tuning capacitor and the connections to the tuning capacitor. So what we did was we bent over the ends of the loop and put a piece of polyethylene sheet between them to make the tuning capacitor. We put some nylon hardware and a bolt so that you could tighten or loosen the hardware to adjust the spacing between the folded over ends to the tuning capacitance. It works. We did some field testing with it, and it was about comparable, if not a little better, than the MFJ 3-foot loop, commercial loop, on 20 meters. The downside was, if you use it outside, you need a very rugged structure, because that flat aluminum sheet will twist and bend in the wind, and it'll detune like mad. Something in the attic, it'd be excellent for, but for general use, it's a little awkward. But it was fun to do. We not only got to design the loop and to fabricate it and make it good enough to work, we also set up a little test range so that we could measure the signal strength at a distance to compare its performance to the MFJ loop. So kind of an engineering exercise as well as homebrewing.
Now, did you have a motor drive that actually changed the separation between the two plates?
Eventually, he put a motor drive. Yes, actually, he did. He had put a motor drive on there. I did it manually. He put a motor drive on there. He found a little geared motor on eBay for like $5 and ran a couple leads from there to tune it. Yeah. That was more practical than my just tuning it by hand.
Yeah, that's very clever. The thing I like about it as well is that the way you excite that loop is with a smaller loop. So your RF is actually going into a loop that's probably 10 times smaller than the larger loop.
Theoretically, about a fifth the size. Yeah,
fifth the size, right? Oh, very cool.
Yeah, it's analogous to a tuned circuit. The main loop is a parallel resonant circuit, and then the feed loop is just a link. It's like a link coupling to a solenoidal coil. Very
cool. If you had to choose only one QRP event to attend in 2019, what would it be?
It's the one I'm going to attend this year. It's 4 days in May out in Ohio.
And I've been there before, and that's actually where I met you in person, and it was a great event.
Yes. Yeah, it is good. It has most of the bright lights of QRPdom and a good presentation of a good program of presentations. And what's particularly neat about it too is the builders' night there, where people do their building, and the vendor night where you can see the QRP vendors and put your hands on things before you actually buy them. That's great. And the community is good, having all the guys there. So you can chat with these guys that you've talked to on the air over the years.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
It's been pretty positive, actually. My family has always liked to travel. We like to go around and see different places. And kind of as an adjunct, me going out to some of these QRP events, to some of the symposia and get-togethers like LobsterCon up in Maine, it gives us an excuse to go out and go to the field. And also, conversely, when we've gone out and camped, we had a pop-up trailer for years. We'd go out somewhere and set up in a campground, and I'd throw a dipole up in a tree and get on the air. I've done that in Disney World down in Florida. I've done it out in any number of Good Sam's, and just tie that into the family activities, so that it doesn't intrude into things, but it goes along with things, and it gives the family an excuse to go out and camp.
Have any of your family members become hams?
No, none of them.
Mine neither.
No, it's funny. Some families it catches on, but it has not caught on in my family. My wife passed away, so my son and I do our traveling now, and he's not caught the bug. He tolerates it, but it's an excuse for us to go out and visit historical places and parks and go visit dead presidents' graves.
Which are national parks, oftentimes.
Many of them are, yes.
Right.
In fact, we visited one grave site of a live president, the Jimmy Carter Library, which is where he's eventually going to be buried. But of course, he's still living.
Right, he's like 94, something like that.
Yeah, he's still going strong. Heaven help him.
What do you think is the greatest challenge facing amateur radio now?
Getting new blood interested. I think that's the greatest challenge. As long as there are people active, there'll be licensing opportunities. There'll be an incentive for the government to keep amateur radio licenses available. And as long as there are people to buy the equipment, there'll be vendors and manufacturers of the equipment. But it's tough getting new blood in there. The kids get hooked on video games and cell phones and doing selfies, and you gotta find a way to hook them to get them interested in amateur radio. And that's always been a challenge. I think it's getting tougher as time goes on, though.
Well, I was having this discussion last week with one of my guests, and I got to thinking that, when you became a ham, and probably even at the time that I became a ham, life expectancy for American males was on the average 67 years.
Yes.
And now I think my doctor told me that in Israel, anyway, the average life expectancy for males is 81 years.
Wow.
So if hams come in, we came in as kids, but if hams are coming in at 35 years of age, which it appears that, a lot of hams are coming in their 30s, they still have 50 years worth of operating or ham radio time. So maybe we've just kind of shifted up, the kids are in their 30s now.
That's a good point, because I've seen that in the local club too. The guys who come along are ones who, they bought a house, they've gone through college and all that kind of stuff, and they have a family, but now they have a little free time. So,
and they've got some money to buy some gear.
And money to buy the gear, absolutely, yeah, good point.
Right, so maybe we can look forward to, or they can look forward to 50 years of operating.
Sure, and many of them do. Yeah.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I think the new technologies. I like the brain is really going. Hans G0 UPL has had a number of good kits, transceivers primarily. The BitX kits are really good, and other things. Not only kits, but other radios are now incorporating microprocessors. to make the radios more feature-filled. I mean, you look at some of the things like the IC 7300, and my God, that's taken it to an extreme. But something like the KX3 and radios of that ilk, and the BitXs, and some of the Hans Summers kits radios, they use microprocessors to control the radios, to control the tuning of the radios, and to give a good display on there to make them more usable, more user-friendly. You go to the extreme, of course, you get into lots of menus that make it very complicated, but that's important. Another thing that I have not gotten heavily involved in is new modes such as the
FT8
AT modes. Yeah.
Right.
Lots of new modes coming out that are cool. Really, the newest thing I've used is, I hate to admit it, is PSK31. But I have FT8 on my computer, and I've dabbled with it, but I've not transmitted yet. Still getting acclimated.
Well, my guess is that at some point your KX3 will have a software update that'll include FT8.
I hope so. The handicap to that and many things is, to be effective, they need a good time source, and they need frequency stability. Frequency stability is doable, but when you're in the field, as I often am, getting a good time source is awkward.
GPS.
Yeah, that's true. It's more complication, but yes, that is probably
the KX3 will have a GPS cover.
I hope so.
I'll send Wayne a message. We need to get Joe a GPS cover.
He may remember me. We have spoken over the years, and I have run into him out in NorCal, so he may remember me.
I'm sure he will. I'm sure he does.
I'm not sure if he remembers me favorably, but
what advice would you give to new or returning hams?
New returning hams?
New or returning hams. What advice would you give them?
Join a club. Get active. I would get your hands dirty. I encourage that to everybody. Build whatever. If you can't build a radio, you can't build a radio interface, build antennas or build something so that you get involved in the mechanics of things and really get hooked into it. Or write some software to come up with a new logging program, or to make an extension to FT8 or something like that. Get involved with new stuff and get your hands dirty.
I just heard on the Ham Nation podcast that somebody bought all the rights to Amico and is now producing the AC1.
Right.
Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing. Yeah, we had a talk, a Skype talk of all things, with Bob Heil at the last Gloucester County Radio Club meeting this week, and Heil brought that out, mentioned Amico and the AC1. Now, I didn't own an AC1, but I built my homebrew version of it because I couldn't afford the real one.
Well, I think for a lot of people who are waxing nostalgic for those transmitters, that'll be a really nice opportunity, especially if they've done a great job. I don't know yet if they've done a great job at duplicating what the original kit looked like.
Yeah. Made a lot of contacts with something like that.
Well, Joe, you've been a terrific guest, and I know it's been a long time coming. We promised each other that we would meet, and we finally have, and I'm so glad that you joined me on the QSO Today podcast. With that, I want to thank you and wish you 73.
Thank you very much for inviting me. 73 to you, Art. Good day.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Joe. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put an N2CX in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.